Welcome to Totally Unrelated, a place for history, trivia, media, brain farts, and the occasional venting session. My name is Diana.
And I am Irina.
And this episode is brought to you by my powers of nagging.
Indeed. So, Diana bugged me for a while to get off my ass and write about this wonderful book called EuGENE by Siddhartha Mukherjee. Hopefully, I didn't butcher the name too much. So, I can say it's been 84 years, but I finally managed. I recommend
everything seems to take a lot with us, so be patient.
Yeah. I recommend everyone to actually read the book, but just in case you might need a push in that direction, maybe me and Diana highlighting some ideas from it will do the trick. Also, I want to preface this with the disclaimer that I will quote extensively from the book. I have to first plug the writing style in itself. Mukherjee has a way of making a vast and complicated subject somewhat easy to follow, and also has the ability of making this subject personal. He makes you care, so don't be afraid of the subject matter.
Yeah, especially because we all know from experience that discussions about nature versus nurture tend to be a bit tricky. Since it's highly unlikely that anyone entering this discussion would, even if they don't have an agenda of their own, they still have some deeply personal values and beliefs that shape the lens through which you choose to select and interpret data. And it's, we believe, a great way to identify potentially shitty people, because they will jump at the opportunity to rationalize what they perceive as sort of their elevated status in the world relative to other groups.
Indeed. That is generally true. But it is not the case with this book.
Mm-hmm.
So, moving on.
One of the good ones, one of the good guys.
Well, exactly. So the book has a prologue, 6 main parts, and an epilogue. But I think more importantly, the book has 3 main themes. And the first one is a historical theme where we get to learn about the most important moments in the discoveries that have to do with genetics. In this part, we learn about the great minds that really advanced this field. But also we learn about some of the downfalls brought by the minds that were not so great and had big ambitions and a general dislike of humanity. You know, here be eugenics. But since we already covered this in previous podcasts, I think it is safe to move on.
Well, I mean, you know, I'm not going to break your flow here, but we're probably going to discuss why these, bad actors, as you said, with a general dislike for humanity, keep appearing again and again throughout history and using science or whatever they can lay their hands on to sort of cudgel and beat others down. So, but do go on.
Well, just to be cute, I could say that the reason they keep popping up, it's, have to do with genetics.
Yeah. Probably.
So moving on, the second theme of the book is the scientific theme. This part might be the least interesting for the people who are not really into the actual research, but I think Mukherjee did a fairly good job of presenting facts without dumbing them down, but also without insisting too much on the technical details. And the third theme, which I might say is a philosophical one, about the ethical dilemmas brought forth by the field of genetics so far and the possibilities of what might be. So starting with the first part of the book, I would say is very much worth reading. I personally loved learning about all these different people of science. Well, some of them were more philosophers than scientists, since the scientific method was still a long way away. But
they were scientist wannabes.
You have to start somewhere.
Yeah, sure.
But before any real science even existed, people asked themselves things like, why do we look like our parents? And also, why don't we look exactly like our parents? And I really loved the story of Mendel, who didn't manage to pass the biology exams of his time because he kept asking questions that were deemed silly, such as, why do elephants give birth to elephants? Why do they never give birth to a mouse or a horse, you know?
Well, he should have asked the really good questions that would have granted him probably a leading position at the time, like how come lords always give birth to lords, I guess.
Yeah.
As we know, that was the right sort of question to ask.
Totally.
Yeah, but wasn't this like also about the time when the idea of spontaneous generation was also still around? The idea that sort of living organisms could arise from inanimate matter rather than as a result of common ancestors, and that the diversity that you would see in the world resulted from different organisms then becoming more complex in their attempt to achieve perfection, which of course, at the end of this progress towards perfection, there was the human race, naturally.
Mukherjee has a really nice phrase about Mendel enrolling in classes to the University of Vienna to pursue his degree in natural sciences. And the phrase goes like this: it was here that Mendel's problems with biology and biology's problems with Mendel would begin. So the main thing in biology at the time was taxonomy, meaning classifying living beings into distinct categories, like they have nothing to do with one another. But there was no particular logic to these categories. So at the time of Mendel going to university, they were aware of the sperm and an egg, and somewhat reluctantly they gave up on the idea of the ready-made human existing as a homunculus in the sperm. And they came up with this idea, this principle of vis essentialis corporis. Like,
if it's Latin, it's good.
Yeah, yes, it's a sort of like magic stuff in a being. So it was a somewhat sciencey way to say some shit happens and we don't really know what it is. So
and wasn't it also a sort of major effort to make sure that however you contort yourself to describe sort of how life comes into being, you make sure that you attribute as little to women as possible in the process?
Of course.
And all the information is within the sperm. The major contribution is done by the guy, and everything. The woman is basically just a vessel.
Yeah, as I said, they were a little bit past that because they had literally seen the sperm and the egg, and by this time they knew you have to combine the two, and somehow, and the time when Mendel was doing his research was actually around the same time that Darwin was putting together his theory of evolution. And even though their respective works were read at least one time at the same conference, nobody saw the link between them. Not even Darwin, who was actually looking for an explanation for heredity, So, yeah, they were a little bit past this idea of, inanimate objects becoming living things, and just the sperm does all the job. They were still in the God has something to do with it anyway. But yeah. Okay, so to get back on track, what we notice in the historical part of the book is that the desire to understand heredity was just as strong as the desire to manipulate heredity since the very beginning of the idea. The actual gene wasn't even a concept known to people Yet great thinkers of the time, like Plato and Aristotle and the like, were already sort of proposing models of heredity, but also inserting, as you do, your own belief in the model, their own beliefs in the models.
But science has absolutely no bias whatsoever. Well, scientists.
Well, at least Plato and Aristotle were not presenting themselves as scientists.
They were opinion writers, right? That's the loophole.
They were opinion. Yes, there was no fact checking. So the thing that Mukherjee tries to convey throughout the book is that you cannot have heredity in the abstract. The moment one person started talking about it, it immediately became concrete. Something that could bring good things for some people and bad things for others.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said that the model I mentioned earlier was sort of outdated by that time, but I think the general concept of this hierarchical chain of existence that Lamarck envisioned, it's the sort of projection of an individual's beliefs onto the topic that you said yourself. And it's not just like a person doing this, one bad actor. These are the early days of colonialism. So all of a sudden, it's not just something that, oh, well, it just happens, but it's also very self-serving because you have people in power who might listen to these guys and go, so what exactly are you saying? Maybe we could use this, and in exchange, perhaps your voices and your books might be read by important people, and you can get a sort of elevated status.
Of course.
And what makes all of this so annoying is that when people today point these sort of happenings, these sort of things out, oftentimes the response is, oh, well, just projecting your obsession with colonialism and imperialism and whatnot onto these things which are somehow very separate from anything that has to do with politics. And actually there's hardly a better example of people projecting their political or philosophical beliefs or prejudices onto everything from arts to science than these influential men in the 18th and 19th century. And all of it done in order to justify why they should be in charge of everything. So
yeah, of course. I mean, it seems obvious to me, but I'm sure some people will disagree.
Well, they tend to, yeah.
Even though we already talked enough about eugenics of eras past in other episodes, I have to mention a very important point Mukherjee makes about this desire to manipulate heredity in search of some sort of perfect or perfected human being. And the book brings up different examples of genes that, while on one hand result in undesirable traits in a given context, sometimes they also predispose us to desirable traits in another context. So this idea of selecting for a specific set of traits is a lot more complicated than a simple pick and mix, because there is always likely to be a trade-off involved in the choices that you are making,
Can you give an example for this sort of thing?
Yeah, I can give one that is, relatively uncontroversial because it's not about, intelligence, beauty, and the like. Yeah. For example, the high prevalence of the mutated cystic fibrosis gene in European population has puzzled geneticists for decades, because if cystic fibrosis is such a little disease, people with cystic fibrosis, especially before any sort of real medicine, they were dying really fast. So why was the gene not cut out of the evolutionary selection? And recent studies posit the theory that the mutant cystic fibrosis gene provided a selective advantage during cholera infections. And cholera in humans causes severe diarrhea. A nice topic. That leads to, acute loss of salt and water, and that leads to dehydration, and in the end it leads to death. And the humans with just one copy of the mutated gene have a slightly diminished capacity to lose salt and water through their membranes, and thus are relatively protected from the most devastating complication of the cholera. So a mutation in a gene can have a dual effect. It can be potentially beneficial if you only have one copy, and it is little when you have two copies, So humans with one copy of the mutant gene have survived cholera epidemics in Europe, when the people who managed to get the unlucky combination and have two of the copies from the mother and the father, they died. But the selective advantage was strong enough to maintain the mutant gene in the population.
And also, for instance, now that maybe in certain places cholera isn't that much of a recurring problem, that gene has yet again become somewhat of a nuisance, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. And that is why this idea, Mukherjee says in the book, that this idea of disease, you cannot have a discussion about disease without context. Nothing is necessarily, unless it's one of those things that you cannot, you are born and you instantly die. Other than that, a lot of the things that we talk about as disease has to do with context. Change the context, the medium, the society, the sensory, and maybe that is not any longer a disease, It's he talks quite a lot about this, and it is interesting. And now to set up the discussion around the ethical dilemmas involved with genetics and thus with the book, it might be of interest to know what gene therapy is nowadays. And gene therapy encompasses germline gene therapy and somatic gene therapy. And the somatic gene therapy means loosely that you introduce a gene into a cell, often a stem cell, into the human body, and that cell divides, replicates, and contains the altered genetic information. And that changes its function and starts doing a different function. So you managed to modify what that gene was doing. And that is different from germline gene therapy, in which the intention is to change the genetic information in a cell that is capable of producing sperm and eggs. So once it does produce a sperm or an egg, it will transmit the genetic change to the next generation in perpetuity. So in this way, you not only change what a gene does, but you change forever the human species.
Okay.
At the moment, germline gene therapy is not allowed in Europe, United States, but let's just say that China said, nobody's saying no to us, and they're genuinely trying. So,
Was it that thing about, I think it was in 2019 or 2018, where they experimented with a gene that would... something to do with HIV or AIDS?
Honestly, I don't remember what they said in the book that they were trying to do. I don't even think that they were necessarily trying to do something other than to prove that they can do it. Yeah. So the therapy from which stem all the interesting questions, biological and ethical questions, is the germline one, So Mukherjee points out that once the gene was discovered and understood, and the human genome was somewhat sequenced, The science of genetics could, this is a quote, the science of genetics could roam freely to explore aspects of human biology that had hitherto seemed impenetrable to it. Genetics had crossed over from the strand of pathology to the strand of normalcy. The new science would be used to understand history, language, memory, culture, sexuality, identity, and race. It would, in its most ambitious fantasies, try to become the science of normalcy, of health, of identity, of destiny. And the attempt to confront human normalcy through genes would also force the science of genetics to confront some of the most complex scientific and moral conundrums in its history. So that's very ambitious, but well, true.
Yeah, when I hear the word normalcy, I tend to bristle.
Yeah, but it is one aspect in which a lot of people are using genetics for. So one of the ideas that Mukherjee presents from the genetic perspective is the idea of human races. Easy subject.
No,
and
piece of cake.
And how useful or not useful this idea is. And the fact that the most often used definition of race is of self-identifying, as being a certain race. One of the facts that Mukherjee points out is that our increasingly shrill debates on race should begin with the recognition that the actual range of human genomic variation is strikingly low. I mean, lower than, let's say, in the chimpanzees. So he points out that even for a somewhat young species like us, some differences do exist, though. What he sees as the problem with racial discrimination is not the inference of a person's race from their genetic characteristic. It is quite the opposite. It is the inference of a person's characteristics from their race. So the question is not, can you, given an individual's skin color, hair texture, language, infer something about their ancestries, their origin? Because of course you can. But the vastly more controversial question is the converse. Given a racial identity, African, Asian, say, can you infer anything about an individual's characteristics? Not just the skin or hair color, but more complex features like their intelligence, habits, personality, aptitudes. So genes can certainly tell us about race, but can race tell us about genes? I think it's the point. In order to answer this question, the book points out something very well demonstrated and quite interesting. And that is that for the most part, the genetic diversity within any racial group dominates the diversity between racial groups, not marginally by an enormous amount. So this degree of intra-racial variability makes race a poor surrogate for nearly any feature. For race and genetics, the genome is a strikingly one-way street. You can use genome to predict where X or Y came from, but knowing where X and Y came from, you can predict very little about a person's genome. The evolutionary explanation is simple. There is a great genetic variation in populations, even in small ones. This individual variation has accumulated over long periods because most genetic variation antedate the separation into continents and perhaps even the origin of the species, so less than 500,000 years ago. There has therefore been too little time for accumulation of substantial divergence. The point being that we are, a lot more alike than we are different.
At this point, I have to ask, if the term of race wouldn't be a very important tool rhetorically and politically, would we still be dancing around the idea? Because, we don't have long-winded discussions about past notions like fumes and humors and animus, notions that not we, our ancestors at one point used to talk about what they knew on the topic. But, as time went on, it was sort of convened that, it's not useful anymore to use these terms. We have to figure out some new terms that would better describe what we are observing. And besides that, race is already a very loaded term. So, I don't know, it just seems like we're trying to argue with flat earthers, only it's about human beings, and I guess maybe one of the reasons why we still have all these very nuanced discussions about the term is because, unlike flat earthers, people who cling on to this notion of race as it was defined in the 18th and 19th century are sometimes people in maybe, more elevated positions that have a vested interest, so to speak, in keeping this term alive. What do you think?
Well, of course, there is that. But as Mukherjee points out, a lot of the idea of race also stems from a person identifying him or herself. And yes. Obviously, we put great importance upon this description of who I am. And somehow race really comes into who I am, and it would be really, really difficult to tell somebody, stop thinking of yourself as white or black or Asian or African American or whatever. Just think of yourself as this group from here to there geographically, because these are the people with which you have, the most in common. And if we do, I don't know, some sort of research on your genes, or we try to come up with some medication or something, we are going to lump you together with these people because you will, respond most likely like them to whatever. It will not resonate with people.
Yeah, so, also it reminds me a bit about the discussion, I think it was in feminist circles, about whether or not we should emphasize sort of the differences in the life experiences of women versus men, but we also want people to stop thinking so much in terms of their gender, and with like a post gender world where you are not constrained by all these things. But on the other hand, the argument is, yes, but when you're trying to advocate for certain policies that would improve women's lives, it's not very useful and pragmatic to sort of contradict yourself by saying, well, but a large component of what it means to be a woman is also social constraints, and so you sort of push and pull at the same time, and you might not end up progressing in any direction. So it's there are some ways that we identify ourselves that maybe it's not necessarily from a scientific point of view the most important, but you cannot move past it. And just as with men and women, you need the difference also from, if you do any sort of science experiments, because that also matters. And you also have all these social implications, so that's also a thing. So the point being that all these things are still here to stay, so it's important to discuss them. Okay, so moving on to the rest of the discussion. Around this time, Mukherjee mentions in the book Charles Murray and his book The Bell Curve. And more interestingly than Murray and his book, he mentions the much debated idea of general intelligence and its genetic origins, and whether intelligence is unequally segregated among races. And Mukherjee, while discussing the statements from the bell curve, is trying to answer three questions, and I will underline them. First question, is the IQ test a great surrogate for intelligence?
And Mukherjee says if it's about certain aspects of performance, sure, it predicts certain aspects of performance in the world. But it is also a very poor predictor of other aspects of performance, apparently even aspects of academic performance. And in some cases, it correlates highly with how you will perform in the world, and in other cases, it does not. His point is that he cannot see an independent variable, a gold standard variable that would help us really know if what we're measuring really is what we think we're measuring. When we use the word intelligence, we use a very powerful word, a word that comes with a lot of cultural and historical baggage attached to it. It is one thing to say someone performs poorly on certain tests, and quite another to say that one person has a low intelligence level.
You're blowing my mind here. You mean to say that Galton's method of just jotting down in his notebook whether a woman he sees he would kill, fuck, marry, kill is not a good way to measure, for instance, beauty? Or, him giving random tests to random people of different classes and his backgrounds is not a good measure of, who's actually smart.
We can safely say Galton was not the best scientist, yes.
Yeah, well, joking aside, the point the point Mukherjee made is very important, I think, and it should be highlighted more because there are many examples I think all of us can conjure up of that demonstrate how squishy terms like intelligence can be. I mean, for one thing, we know how the idea of intelligence often overlaps in people's heads with the idea of having an elevated status. So, for instance, many will assume that rich people or people who are generally successful, they must also be intelligent, even if they might concede that, well, okay, maybe they're not smart in an academic way, but they're savvy, they are cunning, they are visionaries, they think on their feet. So people not only concede that something like street smarts is different in nature from academic performance, but often they also value one over the other on a case-by-case scenario. So again, if the person with the street smarts is also successful, their type of intelligence is valued over that of the university professor, right? But if you don't make it, which is usually defined in financial terms, then nobody cares about your astuteness, and you do well to shut up and listen to what smarter people have to say. We also know that in order to be considered an intelligent or a wise person in, say, medieval Europe, involved a different set of skills than, say, in China around the same time. There are also class differences we can apply to this label. A wise village elder has a particular set of skills that earns him the label of intelligence, whereas a prince would probably present a different set of skills to earn the same title, so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we look for is definitely important, and it's one of the points that when we look for performances in particular tests, the more we define the test as a surrogate for whatever trait we might be trying to measure, chances are we're going to find genetic determinancies of that. As an example, if we decide that beauty is having blue eyes, then sure, we can say that beauty is genetic. Or in sports, if we say being a great athlete means running a certain distance in a certain amount of time, we will find genetic determinancies for that. Mm-hmm. As we enter a clearly toxic arena, we have to be very careful what we are measuring and how come we have arrived to certain definitions. And as the world advanced and we all became more specialized, this idea of general sportsman means less today just as this idea of multidisciplinary personalities and intelligence in all things means a lot less it is a lot less likely today than it used to be. And it is important to remember that we have arrived at this cultural idea of intelligence by way of history, with all of the different biases from different eras about what is important and what not, as you said, and what we think takes brains and what we think it does not. And those historical and cultural circumstances that gave us the definition are worth questioning, of
It
course.
just popped into my mind that it's so fascinating oftentimes to see arenas that we usually associate with certain things like physical abilities, you know, speed, endurance, stamina, strength. And even in those fields, you have certain athletes that reach a certain level of performance and are admired because they don't have the same physical level and abilities like most of their other peers. And yet they make it in the game because they play off their whatever it is that they do possess as a skill set. So it's also interesting because even if in theory you might not have the necessary skills or the level of skills that would make you perform, sometimes, you know, this is the beauty of sort of human adaptability. You can find ways to use what you do have and sort of gain a competitive advantage.
Yeah, or probably an easier and simpler explanation is that the skill set for a particular sport or whatever activity we're going to do is a lot more complex than we think in the first place.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's not so surprising. It's just that we sort of honed in or on one or two things because basketball comes to mind because I have recently watched the documentary on Netflix about Michael Jordan, and he was considered not as tall. Somehow that he should be a little bit taller in order to be sure that he will really make it in the game. But what ended up defining him as and making him one of these great athletes of all times and transcending his sport was not necessarily that he was whatever yay tall and how he put the ball in the basket, but what resonated with a lot of people was his drive, his desire to win. And if I can just mix a lot of things that have nothing to do with one another, I have greyhounds. And greyhounds are dogs that are bred for running for them to just want to run without anybody telling them to run. And this ability in the dogs, at least, I don't know if it's in humans also, but in the dogs it's called gameness. How willing to play the game they are. And most definitely Jordan's gameness was, the most amazing thing about him. So surely there are a lot of things involved when you become particularly good and recognized, because that's also something to somehow manage to match at the same time your skills, whatever those might be, in a certain activity, and to also have the environment that will acknowledge your ability in that environment, because what good does it do a certain painter that now his paintings are being sold with millions of dollars if at the time of their life they were poor as fuck and nobody bought a painting, So it's about what skills you have, what skills we think are worthy, and what we are interested at the time. Sort of. Okay, so
So again, Galton's way was not the right way.
no.
Oh, damn. It was so easy though.
So what Mukherjee points out is that the concept of IQ is a powerfully self-reinforcing one. It measures a quality imbued with enormous meaning and value whose job is to propagate itself. The circle of its logic is perfectly closed and impenetrable, yet the actual configuration of the test is relatively arbitrary. Also, the tricky thing about the notion of G is that it pretends to be a biological quality that is measurable and is heritable, while it is actually strongly determined by cultural priorities. It is, to simplify it somewhat, the most dangerous things of all, Mukherjee says, a meme masquerading as a gene.
Does this have anything to do with the fact that apparently people who are given an IQ test tend to perform better a second time around if they receive training for taking that particular kind of test?
Well, that is one aspect of it, yes. But what Mukherjee was mostly trying to do here is to joke about the fact that we have actually more like somebody's idea, a meme, that a lot of people are trying to insist it's not about what they believe, but it is a genetical fact, a gene, you know? So this was mostly what he was.
So instead of a
referring to.
definition, it's like, no, this is something very clearly quantifiable.
Yeah. If the history of medical genetics teaches us one lesson, it is to be wary of precisely such slips between biology and culture. Humans, we now know, are largely similar in genetic terms, but with enough variation within us to represent true diversity. Or perhaps more accurately, we are culturally or biologically inclined to magnify variations, even if they are minor in the larger scheme of the genome. And tests that are explicitly designed to capture variances in abilities will likely capture variances in abilities. And this variation may well track along racial lines, but to call the score in such a test intelligence, especially when the score is uniquely sensitive to the configuration of the test, is, to insult the very quality it sets out to measure. So the second question Mukherjee highlights is whether testing on the IQ test is heritable and or inheritable. Heritable means if there is a powerful genetic component to it, and inheritable is about how likely is that trait marches through generations in an intact form. So we measure heritability through twin studies. It seems that the results in IQ tests are highly heritable. Twins share a high concordance. And looking at studies of fraternal versus identical twins, we can extrapolate that multiple genes interaction are involved. So far, no single gene seems to be involved by itself. So the IQ seems to be one of the many human features that is heritable, but it is not easily inheritable. But even if you know that a trait is highly heritable, that does not mean you know for sure that that trait is not also at the same time stunted by external stimuli. For example, height is definitely heritable. But if we go to a certain place and we see people being a certain average height, we don't know just by looking if they cannot be taller if we change their food or some other aspect of their environment,
Ooh. I have an example for this. I actually know stuff.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, apparently in Meiji era Japan, there were some important shifts in the diet. So, for instance, the Japanese were not wholly vegetarian. They did eat fish, and they also ate like small gains, like rabbits and stuff like that. But they weren't big red meat eaters, for instance. And following the 19th century, there was a significant increase in the consumption of meat, and especially red meat. And this led to a growth spurt in the average height of the population within a few generations. And what I found out is that it's not just a one-way street. There was a write-up in the New Yorker following a discussion with a professor from the University of Munich, John Komlosch, about varying heights in the US throughout periods of its history. And the professor says that around the time of the Civil War, Americans' heights predictably decreased. Union soldiers dropped from 68 to 67 inches in the mid-1800s, and similar patterns held for West Point cadets, Amherst students, and free blacks in Maryland and Virginia. By the end of the 19th century, however, the country seemed to set to regain its eminence. The economy was expanding at a dramatic rate, and public hygiene campaigns were sweeping the cities clean at last. For the first time in American history, urbanites began to outgrow farmers. Finally, another important point made on the topic was this. But though climate still shapes mouse, oxen, and giraffes, and a willowy Inuit is hard to find, its effects on industrialized people has almost disappeared. Swedes ought to be short and stocky, yet they've had good clothing and shelter for so long that they're some of the tallest people in the world. Mexicans ought to be tall and slender, yet they're so often stunted by poor diet and diseases that we assume they were born to be small.
Yeah, those are great examples, and very, I think, very easy to understand and to see. About the third question that Mukherjee asks on this topic is racial genetics. To what extent does race have anything to do with IQ? And things that are heritable but are not inheritable tend not to run in races, the way in which we commonly construct them. The Victorian idea of race does not really make all that much sense. It seems that it is a lot more useful to construct races, or anyway, to group people in clusters according to geographic distribution, more than the color of their skin. So Mukherjee's point in the book is that we can talk about IQ as long as we understand that there are many pieces that make up the concept, and that there are many things to take into consideration when we see IQ test results. Things like how circular is the definition of intelligence, what IQ tests actually measure, how much does it rely on a particular form of testing, how much is the environment, is the reason or the motivation in someone taking this test important, because apparently it is. With different motivations, people perform in different ways on the same test. Is the same, is the self-identification of race a real thing? And none of these questions have, as of yet, definitive answers. So not only is it not a good idea to have a very black and white conclusion, yes, pun intended, about this test, but it's even worse to then even go one step further and claim to want to make public social policies based on these tests, as, Murray might suggest.
Yeah, he's trash.
Yeah, so I genuinely think that Mukherjee's approach to this subject is very nuanced and balanced. And I think he puts some really interesting questions forth, And anybody who wouldn't actually try to answer his questions, but just insist that, facts are facts and they don't care about your feelings or some shit.
And what does the science say? What does the science say? And if it doesn't say what they want to, then, well, it's because everyone is a leftist, even in the scientific field or SJW or whatever the slur of the day is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the science is just trying to
cultural Marxist.
to the snowflakes agenda or something. I and also I heard Mukherjee also in other interviews talk about this topic, and he really struck me as being very a very balanced guy. And also like he was asked about being somehow unfair to Murray, and this was in an interview, and to my delight, his answer was that he actually spoke at length to Murray, and they emailed back and forth, and he actually told his opinions to Murray, and well, Murray didn't agree, but they genuinely had a conversation about these things. So his couple of pages on this book did not come from some sort of resentment toward Murray or his book. He just have a different approach and a different way of incorporating all the data, not just some studies.
Yeah, and also I guess if you're like Mukherjee, who seems to, he knows his shit, so to speak.
Yeah.
You have the confidence to just confront whomever because you know your facts, you know your arguments, you can present them clearly and precisely. Probably you can also counter whatever the other person will throw at you. And at the end of the day, we all know that there are bad faith actors who don't register any of your arguments either way, because their purpose is to just win the debate or to keep alive in the public sphere a certain discourse, however corrosive it might be. And at the end of the day, if the person does not really wish to engage in an actual discussion, then you've tried, and next time there's no point in talking to them directly, because they're not going to actually discuss anything. So you're just going to stick to your guns.
Yeah, I mean, what I think makes Mukherjee particularly interesting person is that on one hand he has the scientific credentials, like he genuinely knows the science when he talks about this. He also have cultural recognition. I mean, people see him as a guy who succeeded in his field, but also as a best-selling author. So he also has the money. People don't see him as somebody who's sort of trying to, now establish himself in this discussion. He's a man also. But
it helps.
It helps. But at the same time, he's of Indian origins, and he comes from a family with a history of mental illness, a heritable mental illness. So he also definitely understands the other side. When you come from a family with a history of mental illness, in this case it doesn't matter if you're from India or America or any European country, you will be looked upon with a certain level of distrust, because it doesn't matter that we know that either you have that disease or it skipped you, it skipped a generation, but somehow the whole family is regarded as a little kind of weird. Yeah.
There's a stigma, yeah.
There definitely is. So his whole book, actually, I haven't said it in the beginning, but his whole book is written from this perspective. He starts with his own family history of mental illness, and he tracks all of this discussion with the story of his family and himself, and the fact that when he finally met somebody he knew he wanted to marry, he knew he had to have this discussion. Look, this is my family. If we're going to get married, if we're going to have children, this is the possibility that our children will have this disease. So he really understands the power of this topic and the importance of these discussions, I think. So I guess this could conclude our first part, right?
Yeah, this will be a two-parter.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.